Great. So let's go ahead and take some questions from Q&A. We have some that started at the very beginning of the session that said, I'd like to hear your opinion on insulating 100% outside the sheathing, no cavity insulation.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. You still have to be able to meet. So the reason it's a good idea is if you're the insulation that's inside of your wall is cooling off the warmth. In fact, maybe I'll go to that particular slide if I can find it here. Oops, pardon me. Let me go back and share this again. This slide right here. So if we have all of our insulation to the outside, we're going to be keeping that vapor control layer really warm, right? So if there was none of that yellow slice there of insulation, we're keeping the warm inside is going to warm up our vapor control layer, right? And so the more insulation we can get to the outside of the vapor control layer, the better. And really, in a perfect world, you wouldn't have any insulation to the inside. So why wouldn't we just build this way, right? So the reason is we have to meet code. Code says that in a 2x6 wall, you have to have R21 in our particular climate zone. In R21, if you're going to be doing, say, EPS insulation at a low density, that could be 6 inches of exterior insulation. Now we're talking about really expensive fasteners, really expensive flashings, really having to figure out how we're going to deal with our windows, big bucks, all that kind of stuff. You might have created like some big any windows where the aesthetics get, changed. And that could be a good aesthetic or a bad aesthetic. But ultimately, it's relatively cheap to blow insulation inside of our walls compared to putting insulation to the outside of the walls. So from a purely building science perspective, the more insulation we can have to the outside of our vapor control layer, the better. So 100%, great. Building science, done, awesome. But we have to take into account aesthetics, and in this case, really, what would that cost, right? So that's the reason why that we kind of split the difference and typically insulate inside those walls. I know of a number of projects that just insulate to the outside. It could be great, for sure.
Benjamin Wilt asks, is there anyone using other brace methods to emit continuous sheathing behind exterior insulation?
Yeah, good question. Because how nice would it be to just frame your wall and then throw some exterior insulation on here and have that work not as it could be your air barrier, it could be your water control layer, it could be your vapor control layer, your thermal layer, and your structural layer, right? You could have this one magical project that does it all. And so a lot of people put a lot of thought into how we can do that. And there are some projects on the East Coast and in the Midwest where some people are doing this, where they're doing some lead-in bracing diagonally and stuff like that they've engineered to work. The problem is in our seismic zone, there's nothing that works besides sheathing to create these shear walls that meet the life safety engineering standards that we need for seismic activity. And so that's why we're having those continuous sheets of typically plywood or OSB as our sheathing. Yeah, I agree. I mean, if we could find that magical product that was as strong as plywood and insulated as good as polyiso and had all the benefits of cork and was as cheap as the EPS foam, someone invent that and you've just become a bazillionaire. And we'll put that on every building that's ever built and it'll be amazing. But until that happens, it just hasn't been invented yet. So we're stuck having to make these compromises, which is what, welcome to life. So.
We have a question, and it's a good reminder. It says anonymous attendee. So if your name is not identified on Zoom, that's how we link your CE credit. But they ask, would it be safe to use facade grade cork with an overlap as your thermal plus finish layer in the Pacific Northwest, no rain screen, mass timber wall, 4 to 5 inches, WRB 3 to 4 inches cork, etc.
Yeah, good question. So I'll clarify for those that might not know, the facade grade cork, they make cork in different densities. and they do make a thicker density cork that can be used as siding. It's meant to be exposure grade, so it can just live outside. There's actually examples of cork in Portugal on one building in particular was built in I think it was like the 16th century or something like that. So it's like 500 or 600 years old. It still has cork. It's green. It's like, it looks crazy, but that cork is still, doing its job. So there's not many other insulation products that have as much like track record as cork, as something like that. And so it can be used as a facade grade. So that's what this question is referring to. And so they're talking about using like a mass timber wall. So this might be something like a CLT, so that cross laminated timber. So you got like a solid wood wall, which would take care of your structure and all that. And then putting this facade grade cork over the top of that. They've talked about putting a WRB, so a weather resistant barrier, on that CLT and then the cork. And so I wish I could draw on the screen now, and I would say, to answer this question, you want to look at our 4 control layers. And if you're ever curious about whether assembly works or not, put it on paper, draw out your assembly, and say, where are my 4 control layers, right? And am I meeting all of these things? And am I meeting them in a way that is cost effective, looks good, is resilient, durable, and all those things, right? So in this case, the bulk water control in this assembly would be that WRB, because again, if you take that cork, even the facade grade cork, and you dump a glass of water on it, it will drip through, right? So our main water bulk control is going to be our WRB in this thing. That's great. And then we're going to talk about our air barrier. In this case, your air barrier could be your CLT. You could tape the seams of your CLT. Or it could be your WRB, right? You could put a mechanically attached WRB on top of that and then tape the seams of the WRB. Or you could use something like a self-adhered WRB, which doesn't require all those staples that create holes, right? And so I would maybe refer you in this assembly to put, a self-adhered WRB on there. So we talked, that's our air barrier, could be that WRB also. Or it could be the taped CLT if used mechanically attached. The next thing to think about, our 3rd control layer would be vapor control. And so as you're thinking about those cars going down that 6-lane highway, turns out wood, CLT, is open. It's very vapor open. It's like it's not there. Water molecules in their gaseous form will just travel right through wood. It's going to hit, in this case, your WRB, and then it's going to hit your cork. The cork is very open. So the least permeable part of this particular assembly would be your WRB. And in this case, it'd be fairly open, probably somewhere in the 10 to 25 range, depending on what you use. And it'll control that vapor and then let it to dry out. So it will work. You want to pay attention if you were in, say, a very, very cold climate, like Minnesota or something like that, being disassembly would work. But if we were in, say, a hot, humid climate like Miami, and you have air conditioning going on the inside, hot, humid air could go from the inside, travel right through all this stuff and condense on the inside of your walls here. And then you got wood, and that could be a problem. So in our climate zone, this could work, right? And so let's see, we talked about bulk water, we talked about air, we talked about vapor, and then thermally, your thermal layer would be wood, which has an R value of 1. In this case, you'd have 4 to 5 inches. So you have R5 of CLT, and then 3 to 4 inches of cork. 3 inches of cork at R4 is about 12, plus your R5, you're at R17. You'd probably have to go to at least 4 inches of cork to meet your code minimum here for the thermal. But you'll really be okay because you don't have much thermal ridging going on at all. So in our climate zone, that can certainly work. Strikes me as being an assembly that would be rad, really cool, embodied carbon sequestering, but also very expensive. And a lot of trades aren't really used to using that. But if you got the right client that's willing to do something like that, awesome.
We have a 2-parter here from Vicki Wooster. She says, use different products. How do you choose which products to and assembly to use in which situations? the cost plus performance for different exfoliation products. What do you use if you're economizing?
Yeah. And so this is what I was trying to get at with, here, let me move to this table that I had at the end here. So it really depends what you're doing and what your client or your high programmatic goals are, right? So if you're in fire country, like the project I mentioned that we're doing, we wanted to use Rockwool because it's got this Class A fire resistance, right? We probably wouldn't go with a Class C, which would be a lot of the foams, right? It's possible we might not be able to get cork too. It's hard to find now also, like with all the supply chain issues. So we're like, well, if we can't do that, we might have to go with wood fiberboard because that's a Class B fire rating. So in that example, fire is the one that's driving it, right? Maybe you've got a client that's really interested in embodied carbon, right? Maybe that's the anonymous attendee that was doing the CLT with the cork, right? It seems like on that one, the big driver is avoiding that embodied carbon. So therefore, you wouldn't want to use something like a Rockwool, which has a really high embodied carbon, right? Or some of the, insulations, some of the XPS insulations are really nasty embodied carbon. They're slowly changing that. Right now, you can get the low embodied carbon XPS insulation in Washington, but not in Oregon. I mean, you can get it, but it's not required. We're doing a project right now where we wanted it, and we called the supplier, and the supplier's like, well, why would you get the stuff from Washington? It costs more. He thought we were nuts. It's because that XPS, that old stuff, is so orders of magnitude worse for the environment than the stuff with the lower embodied carbon. So, a big driver is cost. There was a picture of a project we did where we used the GPS insulation. We at our company 2 years ago made a commitment to not use any petroplastic foams above grade. But this was done a couple of years back before that when we were still doing that. And the reason we went with the GPS, even though we knew we were using fossil fuel-based plastic foams with a higher embodied carbon, was because they were on a budget. This was with two professors that were retiring. They were building a modest house. The biggest driver in our program was cost, right? So then we're like, okay, well, we're gonna have to use the foams, which means that those foams are less vapor permeable. They're more compressive, right? I mean, you look at the GPS, we're between 5 and 25 PSI, right? So the type 1 GPS that we used, which is the most affordable, was 5 PSI. And so we had to be very careful when we were installing it not to compress it. But we did because the driver of that project was cost, right? And so hopefully I'm answering your questions here. It really kind of depends on what's your assembly, what are your goals, and then choose the product that works. I mean, it could be something like your team or whoever your contractor is has experience with using one product or another. And so maybe that's why you use it, right? Availability right now is a huge one. You can't get GPS right now either. We can only get EPS. So many of these things you can't get. The polyisos, you can still get those right now. The XPS you can get fine. Wood fiber board, you can find it, still available. So maybe that's why you would choose something, because like, wow, our client really wants to use wood fiber board because we think that's the winner for all the reasons that we think that we're concerned about, but we can't get it, so.
Josh, Wesley Price had mentioned hempwool. What is your opinion on hempwool?
I'm not aware of any hemp wool that's rigid enough for use in exterior insulation. We used it in a project last year for some interior wall insulation. I think it's great. I think it's a great product. It may be available in higher densities for exterior insulation. I'm just simply not aware of it. Maybe they can source that. I know that with the interior bat hemp insulation, we were able to get it through various means, but I know that a lot of people could not get it. It's a relatively new product. There's not a ton of it, but it meets a lot of these like embodied carbon, exposure fire resistance. It's a really cool thing, and I really do hope to see more of it in the future. Honestly, if there's no reason they couldn't make it into a higher density product, I think it's brilliant. It's just kind of early days. You don't tend to see a lot of it.
Perfect. Adam Cohen says, can wood fiber board be installed directly to the studs without sheathing as a nail base? What about 24-inch OC studs?
Yeah, so this is similar to the question that we addressed kind of right off the top. No, you can't install that directly to the studs because you have to have that seismic shear wall, sheathing. So you got to have some sort of cross bracing or something like that. Now, I suppose you could put a shear wall on the inside of your wall, and then, it would insulate and then put your cork on the outside, but for your wood fiber, but then you have to attach your siding. So you definitely would have to use battens. You have to figure out how we can attach our WRB, because the nice thing about sheathing is it gives you a nice strong backing to attach your WRB to make it nice and durable. So maybe if you're on the East Coast or a non-seismic zone, or you got super creative with your engineering, again, if you're doing that kind of out of the box engineering, you want to think about, are we creating, we just moved our vapor control layer to the inside. What kind of impact does that have on our buildings, right? So again, if you're considering something like that, definitely talk to your structural engineer. If you can get a structural engineer to actually buy into that with you and calc it out for you and figure out how to do it, go for it. But also think about all those other 4 control layers and how you're accounting for those. So,
well, and Adam also asked about wood fiber board's ability to shed water. So like Go claims their upcoming product is timber board is hydrophobic.
Yeah. So when you go buy Gutex at 475 supply, or you go buy, you can get, there's Agapon, which you don't tend to see a lot of anymore. There's Gutex, which is available through, why am I blanking? New Energy Works. Or you can get Agapon, Gutex, and Styco are the 3 main types of wood fiber board. They do have like a wax in them. And in Europe, they use them for highly exposed areas that have, see a lot of bulk water. And these manufacturers will tell you that you can use it as your WRB. I've had a bunch of conversations with a number of people about this, specifically this person, Christine Williamson, who I highly recommend following. If you don't know her, she has a Instagram account called Building Science Fight Club, works at Building Science Corporation. She's Joe Steebrook's daughter, who's kind of the who's who. He's the guy of building science. Anyways, I've had conversations with her about this, and she just does not see that wood fiber over the long term. We're talking 20 years, 40 years, 60 years down the road, seeing that kind of exposure being, it's a risk calculation, right? If you're someone that's building a multi-million-dollar home for a custom client, you might not want to take that risk, right? And so for us, what we do is we just solve it fairly simply. And we just say, well, I'm not going to take that risk of having that wood fiber get exposed to water over time, potentially be a problem. I'm just going to simply move our WRB to the outside of the wood fiber board. Problem solved. And in some ways, if you use like that Thermalbuck product that I talked about, you can actually integrate that into your Windows assemblies and stuff like that really easily. So it's not like, in some ways, maybe it's making life easier by moving that WRB to the outside. The thing about the wood fiber and that paraffin wax too is that you got to think about compatibility of components. So tapes, these acrylic tapes that you see from like Siga or Proclima or all these like Partel, there's a bunch of different like really high performance European tapes, acrylic tapes, even zip system tape is acrylic, doesn't stick to that wax. It'll peel right off. It just does not adhere to that. So you're stuck, going, if I'm going to use this, I can't use the tapes for my air barrier or for attaching my flashings and stuff like that anymore. So I have to use a liquid applied product, which is fine because the liquid applied products do stick to it, but it's a different process and it's a different material. It's a different cost. but things you definitely want to think about with that. So for us, we try to keep it simple, stupid. Move the WRB to the outside if we're using the wood fiber board. Admittedly, it's our go-to assembly right now. We're building 3 houses with the wood fiber board because of all of the benefits of the embodied carbon and all this stuff. We just simply move the WRB to the outside, and it's for our team pretty quick and easy. We make sure to use liquid applied products if we need to stick something to the wood fiber.
Well, and that might feed into another question. How about using adhesives to avoid thermal bridging?
I usually tend to think of adhesives being a fairly thin layer. I mean, if you're sticking something to something else, what are we talking about? Maybe, you know, an 1/8 inch, maybe if you have a really thick bead of acoustical sealant or something like that, maybe you got a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. But let's say you had, you know, an entire inch of adhesive from the one thing you wanted to stick to the next. And I can't really think of where this would come into play, but let's say you did. Well, what's the R value of that, you know, adhesive? R3, R4, you got 1 inch of it, so you got R4, maybe. But I don't know that. I guess I need more information about what specifically are you talking about. Maybe you got a particular assembly in mind or something like that, and maybe a little more information I could help with that. But I tend to think about thermal bridging. What's the R value? How thick is it? And what's that doing for you? And will that work for that particular scenario? Do we want to get to Vicky's last question, or do we want to just kick it off? Okay, cool. All right, so she has a question about she'll be marketing stock plans. You know, what do I do to show wall assemblies when the plan might be built in whatever climate zone, right? And she says, in addition to noting that the purchaser should contact a green builder in their area. Yeah, I mean, you really got to think about this. Like I mentioned, if you're using wood fiber or a cork or something like that, and someone builds that in Miami, you could have some real big problems, right? So I would refer you to Building Science Corporation. Joe Stiebrook, again, he's the principal of that company, wrote an article about maybe 10, 12 years ago called The Perfect Wall. And basically what you can do if you really wanted to make high performance plans that you can be built anywhere, whether you're in Anchorage or if you're in San Diego, Minneapolis, or Miami, you're going to want to have exterior insulation as much as possible, and you're going to want to make it vapor impermeable, because that will work in any climate, because you're going to stop vapor transfer from happening from the inside to the out or the outside to the in. All right. And so if you were to use something like, you know, 6 inches of XPS insulation, or, you know, 4 inches of exterior foil-faced polyiso insulation, that could work. The problem is that those vapor impermeable insulations tend to have a lot of embodied carbon. It will have to tend to be pretty thick, and you want to make sure that it's continuous. And so you want to make sure those are taped and sealed with a vapor closed tape. Also, you don't want to get vapor getting into your client's house that they bought from your stock plans and building it in Panama and just rotting. So that article, The Perfect Wall by Joe Stiebrook, explains the science behind that and what can work for a wall assembly anywhere. You may want to think about, you know, potentially, it's challenging. You'd have to draw up a different type of wall assembly for every climate zone. And then within climate zones, there could be differences with microclimates and stuff like that. So as we get into these low load buildings and we're worried about these things, it becomes very local. It's just like vernacular architecture. There's a reason why there's thatched huts where there's palm trees. There's reasons why people build with brick in cold climates. There's reasons why people build with mud, and, you know, because it works for that local climate. And as soon as you try to create something that's supposed to work everywhere, it's very hard. It used to work with code level homes where we put 80,000 BTU gas furnaces in there. It doesn't work when you start putting in low load. Doesn't have a drying capacity. So super challenging.
All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and draw today's session to a close. So appreciate you all very much and look forward to hopefully seeing you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.